Kelly Donovan joined the Waterloo Regional Police Service in Canada with a deep sense of purpose. Her Christian faith guided her commitment to justice and compassion, especially for the vulnerable. She believed policing was a calling, a way to serve both her community and God. From the moment she put on her uniform for the first time, she felt a mix of pride and humility. It wasn't just a job to her. It was a mission. While others saw policing as a steady career with benefits, Kelly saw it as ministry in action. She believed that her badge was more than metal. It was a symbol of trust. And trust, she knew, was sacred. Growing up in a Christian household, Kelly was taught to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Her parents instilled in her the value of integrity, doing the right thing when no one was watching. She carried those lessons with her into adulthood, and eventually into her career as a police officer. When she entered the police academy, she quickly stood out. She wasn't the fastest runner or the strongest cadet, but she carried herself with a determination that couldn't be ignored. She listened intently, took detailed notes, and often stayed behind to help others who struggled. Her instructors noticed her empathy and her deep sense of justice. She wasn't just learning how to enforce the law. She was learning how to embody it with fairness and compassion. On graduation day, Kelly's family filled the auditorium, cheering as she received her badge. Tears streamed down her mother's face as she whispered, "This is who you were meant to be." Kelly believed it too. She silently prayed, asking God to use her as a light in a profession often overshadowed by darkness. From her very first patrol shifts, Kelly approached policing differently than some of her peers. When she responded to domestic disputes, she didn't just see offenders and victims. She saw broken families who needed hope. When she dealt with homeless individuals, she didn't dismiss them as nuisances but recognized them as people with stories, struggles, and souls in need of compassion. Her colleagues sometimes teased her for caring too much. They told her she'd bane out quickly if she got too emotionally invested. But Kelly couldn't help it. Her faith wouldn't allow her to treat people like case numbers. To her, every call mattered. Every person mattered. Over time, she began to see how her Christian worldview clashed with the culture around her. Some officers carried cynicism like a shield, numbed by years on the job. Others treated the uniform as power rather than responsibility. Kelly understood that policing was hard and often thankless, but she refused to let bitterness define her. She leaned on prayer, often whispering scripture to herself during difficult shifts. Her Bible sat in her locker, a reminder that her strength didn't come from her alone. But even in those early years, Kelly noticed cracks in the system. There were moments when policies didn't make sense, when victims weren't treated with respect, when corners were cut in the name of efficiency. At first, she brushed them aside, assuming they were isolated incidents. After all, no system was perfect. No workplace was without flaws. Still, those cracks gnawed at her. She had joined the service to uphold justice, but sometimes what she saw didn't look like justice at all. She began journaling about her experiences, writing late into the night after long shifts. It was a way of processing the tension between her ideals and reality. In those journals, she prayed through her doubts, asking God for wisdom and strength. Kelly often reflected on the story of Esther in the Bible. Esther had been placed in a position of influence for such a time as this. Kelly wondered if her role in policing was similar, that God had placed her there not just to enforce laws but to confront deeper injustices. It was a sobering thought, but one that gave her a sense of direction. The community respected her. People remembered her kindness. She wasn't the officer who barked orders or rushed through reports. She was the one who listened, who looked people in the eye, who treated them with dignity. In a profession often criticized for lacking empathy, Kelly stood apart. But behind her growing reputation was a growing awareness. Something wasn't right. She had witnessed fellow officers cutting deals, dismissing complaints, and protecting each other in ways that raised troubling questions. At first, she convinced herself that it was part of a bigger picture she couldn't yet see. Maybe there was justification. Maybe it wasn't her place to question. Yet the more she saw, the more uneasy she became. And the more she prayed, the more she sensed God was preparing her for something bigger. Kelly's calling into policing wasn't just about writing tickets or responding to emergencies. It was about truth. It was about shining light in places where shadows lingered. She didn't know it yet, but the same faith that had carried her into the profession would soon carry her into the fight of her life. The first chapter of her journey wasn't about scandal or corruption. It was about conviction, about the formation of a woman who would later risk everything to speak the truth. For Kelly, policing began as a sacred calling, a chance to serve, protect, and love her neighbor as herself. But soon, that calling would collide with corruption so deep, it would test everything she believed. And when that test came, the Christian woman who joined with hope and faith would be forced to decide, stay silent and protect herself, or risk it all to expose the truth. Everything changed in 2016. Kelly discovered fellow officers were involved in covering up cases of domestic abuse and harassment, sometimes even among their own ranks. She saw firsthand how victims were ignored, investigations were buried, and the good old boy network protected its own. Her faith made it impossible to turn a blind eye. Kelly knew silence would make her complicit. At first, it started with whispers in the hallways, conversations cut short when she walked by. She began to notice how complaints made by women, especially those within the service itself, seemed to vanish into thin air. A victim might come forward with courage, hoping for justice, but their file would mysteriously stall. Paperwork went missing. Evidence couldn't be found. Statements were marked incomplete, even when Kelly knew they had been given in full. One night, after a long shift, Kelly sat in her cruiser replaying a call in her mind. A woman had reported abuse by her partner, who was also a fellow officer. The victim's face was bruised, her voice shaking as she begged for help. Kelly had done everything by the book: photographs, statements, a detailed report. But days later, when she followed up, she was told the case was being handled internally. No charges, no accountability. The victim stopped returning calls, and the officer in question was back on patrol, smiling as if nothing had ever happened. It was a punch to the gut. Kelly knew that if the roles were reversed, if an ordinary citizen had been accused of the same crime, the law would have come down hard. But when it came to police officers, the rules seemed to bend. The deeper she looked, the worse it became. She learned that harassment complaints inside the service were treated the same way. Female officers who spoke up against inappropriate comments or unwanted advances often found themselves reassigned, isolated, or pressured to drop the matter. Instead of protecting the vulnerable, the system was protecting itself. Kelly couldn't reconcile this with her oath. She had sworn to serve and protect. She had sworn to uphold justice without fear or favor. But here she was, watching the law manipulated to shield those who wore the same uniform as she did. It shook her to the core. For the first time, she questioned not just individual behavior, but the culture itself. Was this what she had signed up for? Was this the organization she had pledged her life to? Her Christian faith gave her no room for compromise. She remembered James 4 verse 17. If anyone, then, knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. Silence was not an option. Every time she looked into the eyes of a victim, whether a civilian silenced by fear or a colleague dismissed by the chain of command, she felt the weight of that scripture pressing on her soul. Still, she wrestled with fear. What would happen if she spoke out? She knew the risks. Whistleblowers in policing didn't just lose their jobs. They lost their reputations, their financial stability, and sometimes even their safety. She had a family to think about. She had a future to consider. But Kelly also knew this. She had been placed in this position for a reason. God had not led her into policing to blend into the shadows. He had called her to shine light into darkness. And in 2016, that calling began to take on a whole new meaning. She started gathering more evidence. She quietly documented cases that vanished without explanation. She kept records of how victims were treated, how investigations were derailed, and how complaints conveniently disappeared. Every note she took, every detail she preserved, added weight to the truth she carried. The burden grew heavier with each passing day. She began to lose trust in those around her. She didn't know who she could confide in, or who might turn against her. Even casual conversations at the station felt loaded, as though every word might later be used against her. What had once been a place of camaraderie and shared purpose now felt like enemy territory. Kelly found herself praying more than ever, asking God for courage, for wisdom, for protection. Late at night, she would sit at her kitchen table, her Bible open, her hands trembling as she asked the same question over and over. Lord, what do you want me to do? The answer was always the same. Tell the truth. But telling the truth would come at a cost she could hardly imagine. For now, Kelly kept her silence publicly. But inside, a fire was building. A fire that would soon erupt into the open, changing not only her life, but the entire Waterloo Regional Police Service. The discovery of corruption in 2016 was more than an awakening. It was the beginning of a battle between light and darkness, truth and lies, faith and fear. And Kelly Donovan was standing right at the center. Kelly Donovan thought that documenting the corruption she had uncovered would be enough to spark reform. She believed that truth had power, that facts would speak louder than politics, and that justice, backed by her faith, would prevail. She prepared her reports carefully, detailing each incident of misconduct, every ignored victim, every thread of injustice woven into the fabric of her police service. She submitted her evidence through official channels, convinced the system would respond with accountability. After all, wasn't that the very purpose of law enforcement? To uphold justice, to root out wrongdoing, no matter where it was found, even if it was within their own ranks. But the response she received was not justice. It was retaliation. At first, the resistance was subtle. Meetings she had once been invited to suddenly excluded her. Cases she had been assigned were quietly reassigned. Her calls for transparency went unanswered. Soon, whispers began circulating around the department. Whispers that branded her as difficult, unstable, or unfit for the job. The very culture of silence she had tried to challenge was closing in on her. Instead of rewarding her integrity, her department charged her with misconduct. Instead of addressing the corruption, they tried to paint her as the problem. She was pulled off active duty, isolated from colleagues she once considered friends, and made an outcast inside her own police service. The message was unmistakable: stay quiet or pay the price. This was no longer just a workplace issue. It was a true crime story of institutional betrayal, a case of police corruption where the system attacked its own truth-tellers. Kelly was not naive. She knew that exposing corruption carried risks. But the ferocity of the backlash stunned her. For the first time, she felt the cold weight of power being used not to protect citizens, but to crush those who dared to question it. She thought of the women whose cases had been buried, the victims whose voices were silenced, and realized, if she gave in, she would be no different than the corrupt cops caught red-handed in her reports. Her faith, which had always been a source of strength, now took on new meaning. It wasn't just about personal belief, it was about action. It was about standing firm in the face of intimidation, about living out the conviction that faith without works is dead. This was faith exposed, not the safe kind spoken of in church pews, but the dangerous kind lived out in hostile workplaces, where every decision could cost you your career, your reputation, even your safety. Still, Kelly would not back down. She doubled down on her documentation, keeping detailed records of every incident, every act of retaliation, every silence forced upon her. She became meticulous, knowing that her paper trail might one day be the only proof of what had happened. She began to see herself not just as a police officer, but as a whistleblower. The term carried weight, risk, stigma, even betrayal in the eyes of some. But for Kelly, it also carried honor. It meant being a guardian of truth when the system itself refused to be. The retaliation grew harsher. She was denied promotions. Supervisors began monitoring her every move. Colleagues who once confided in her now avoided her in hallways, afraid of being tainted by association. Isolation became her daily reality. To the public, the Waterloo Regional Police still projected an image of integrity and service. But behind closed doors, Kelly was living in what could only be described as a script of a crime documentary, a hidden world where loyalty to silence outweighed loyalty to justice, and where protecting the institution mattered more than protecting victims. Her case began to attract attention. Activists, journalists, and even advocates of transparency began to see her struggle as part of a broader pattern. Around the world, similar stories were surfacing. People punished for speaking out, institutions shielding the guilty while punishing the innocent. Some compared her case to a kind of First Amendment audit in practice, not in the American sense of testing public recording rights, but in the deeper sense of testing whether freedom of speech, truth, and accountability could survive inside powerful institutions. Was speech truly free if it cost you your livelihood? Was truth really valued if it threatened the wrong people? Kelly understood the cost. She knew her name would be dragged through the mud, her reputation questioned, her motives doubted. But she also knew the alternative, silence, was impossible. To be silent would be to betray not only the victim she had sworn to protect, but also the God she served. Her choice was not between safety and danger, but between compromise and integrity. And for Kelly Donovan, integrity was non-negotiable. So she stood, alone. Each day she walked into the station, she carried herself with quiet defiance. Each report she filed was an act of resistance. Each prayer whispered in the solitude of her home was a declaration that she would not be broken. This was the cost of truth. This was the life of a whistleblower. And though the walls were closing in, Kelly's faith told her something the institution could not silence. The truth, eventually, would prevail. The storm around Kelly Donovan did not pass. It grew stronger. What began as subtle whispers and exclusions soon escalated into full-blown retaliation. The institution she had once sworn to serve was now weaponized against her. Every day became a test of endurance. Psychological pressure was constant. Supervisors scrutinized her every move, twisting even the smallest details into allegations of misconduct. What should have been routine tasks became traps, carefully laid to discredit her. It was as though her every breath was under surveillance, every action judged through the lens of hostility. Her colleagues, once companions in service, now looked at her with suspicion or avoided her altogether. The same hallway she had walked with pride now felt like narrow tunnels closing in on her. The culture of silence had chosen its side, and Kelly was left to walk the path of truth alone. The department filed multiple misconduct charges against her. The accusations were vague, sometimes absurd, but their purpose was not justice, it was intimidation. By drowning her in legal battles and disciplinary hearings, they hoped to exhaust her spirit, to make the fight so costly that she would eventually give up. Yet Kelly knew the truth. These charges were not about misconduct. They were about punishment for speaking out. They were the language of power, designed to silence, to isolate, and to erase her credibility before the public ever had a chance to hear her story. Then came the settlement offer. It was presented not as an act of fairness, but as a deal, peace in exchange for silence. All she had to do was sign a non-disclosure agreement, walk away quietly, and never again speak of the corruption she had witnessed. For many, the temptation would have been overwhelming. A settlement meant relief, an end to the daily battles, a way out of the relentless scrutiny and pressure. It meant she could reclaim a semblance of a former life, free from the shadows of retaliation. But it also meant betrayal. To accept the deal would be to betray the victims whose cases had been buried, the women silenced by the very system sworn to protect them. It would mean erasing her own voice, conceding that truth was too costly to tell. It would mean selling integrity for comfort. Kelly could not do it. Her refusal was not born of stubborn pride, but of conviction. Her Christian faith had always guided her actions, and now it demanded more than ever. She remembered the words she had built her career upon. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Her faith was not a decoration for Sundays. It was the foundation of her courage. To sign away her voice would be to sign away her calling, her identity, and her obedience to God. Kelly understood that the truth was not hers to bury. It was her responsibility to proclaim, regardless of the cost. And so, she refused. The retaliation only deepened. The institution turned colder. Meetings about her fate happened behind closed doors, where decisions were made to strip her of dignity piece by piece. She was labeled untrustworthy, difficult, and insubordinate. Each label was designed to sever her credibility, to make her warnings appear like the ramblings of a disgruntled employee rather than the testimony of a dedicated officer. But with every blow, her resolve hardened. She realized that retaliation was not a sign of her failure. It was proof that her words carried weight. If her testimony were meaningless, there would be no need to silence her. The very intensity of their attacks revealed the depth of the corruption she had exposed. Kelly began to understand that her struggle was bigger than her own story. It was not only about one officer in Waterloo. It was about a system that resisted accountability at every level. It was about how power protected itself, even at the expense of justice. Her battle became a symbol of what happens when one person dares to confront institutional wrongdoing. This realization gave her strength. Though she often cried alone, though the pressure sometimes felt unbearable, though friends and colleagues had abandoned her, she knew she was not standing in vain. Each prayer whispered in the stillness of her home reminded her that truth has a defender greater than any earthly power. The settlement, with its promise of silence, was the easiest path. But Kelly's refusal transformed her into something more than a disgraced officer in the eyes of her department. She became a living example of resistance, proof that there are still those who will not trade integrity for comfort. She would not take the deal. Her story would not be buried under legal paperwork. Her voice would not be bought. And though the retaliation intensified, though the price of her stand grew heavier by the day, she chose the path of integrity. She chose to risk it all, because to Kelly Donovan, silence was never an option. For 6 long years, Kelly Donovan carried the weight of resistance. She endured isolation, legal battles, and unrelenting pressure. Each day was a reminder of what happens when one officer dares to challenge the silence of an entire institution. In 2022, the burden reached its peak. Kelly made the hardest decision of her life. She resigned from the Waterloo Regional Police Service. Walking away was not easy. She left behind her career, her pension, and the stability she had built over years of service. She sacrificed the profession she had once embraced as a calling. But she kept something far more important, her voice. She refused to sign the non-disclosure agreement, the final chain designed to silence her. By rejecting it, she preserved her freedom to speak, to warn, and to advocate. It was the ultimate act of defiance against a culture that demanded loyalty to silence over loyalty to justice. Kelly understood the cost. She had given up everything she had worked for. But in her heart, she knew she had gained something greater, integrity. Kelly did not allow bitterness to define her. Instead, she transformed her pain into purpose. She became an advocate, not only for victims of police misconduct, but also for whistleblowers who, like her, risked everything to tell the truth. She began sharing her story across Canada, standing before audiences at conferences, universities, and community events. Her voice, once silenced within the walls of her department, now carried farther than ever before. Her book, Police Line, Do Not Cross, became both a memoir and a warning. It was a beacon for those trapped inside institutions where corruption thrived, a reminder that silence serves only the oppressor. Kelly also joined a class action lawsuit against her former department. This lawsuit alleged systemic gender discrimination, sexual harassment, and assault within the Waterloo Regional Police Service. Her participation proved that her story was not an isolated case but part of a much larger pattern, a system that punished truth and protected abuse. Through advocacy, writing, and legal action, Kelly's mission grew larger than herself. She was no longer just a whistleblower. She was a leader in a movement demanding accountability and transparency in policing. On paper, Kelly's career ended in loss. She gave up her badge, her pension, and the stability of a lifelong profession. To many, that might look like defeat. But Kelly knew differently. Her victory was not measured in promotions or pensions. It was measured in courage. She had stood for truth when it mattered most. She had refused to compromise her integrity, even when the price was unbearable. Her courage became contagious. Other officers, inspired by her stand, began to come forward. Investigations were launched. Public awareness of police corruption deepened. Conversations about reform gained momentum. Kelly's personal sacrifice rippled outward, sparking change that reached far beyond the walls of her former department. She proved that one voice, grounded in faith and conviction, can challenge an entire system. And while her badge had been taken, her authority as a moral leader only grew stronger. Kelly Donovan's story is not just one of corruption and retaliation. It is a story of faith, courage, and unshakable conviction. She risked everything, her career, her security, her relationships, because her faith demanded she protect the innocent and speak truth to power. Her words capture the essence of her journey. "I couldn't stay silent and still call myself a Christian," Kelly says. "My faith taught me that protecting the vulnerable is worth any sacrifice. Even when the system fails, God's justice prevails." Kelly's story stands as a powerful testimony to faith over fear, to conviction over compromise, and to the belief that truth, no matter how fiercely resisted, cannot be silenced forever. Her life is a reminder to all of us. Systems may fail, but courage endures. Power may retaliate, but faith remains. And when one person chooses to stand, others find the strength to rise beside them.